Venetia. 1,000 comments.
Selling a hemorrhoid cream to someone who's got hemorrhoids.
Got a whip.
I was born into a deep contradiction.
This stuff's magic.
Oh, that's so clever.
Oh, there's a ghost in the machine. Something weird happened there. That's the sort of thing that gets off to a worrying start on live broadcasts. Good afternoon and welcome to Artefact Live with me, Scott MacArthur, where we look at the art and the science of storytelling. That does give you the heebie-jeebies when you do this quite a lot and something funny happens. Anyway, so welcome back. Thanks very much for tuning in last week. We had a really good show. It's my most viewed show so far, actually, and that was around philosophy, believe it or not, looking at the philosophy of storytelling with the wonderful Nick Shackleton-Jones. We had a right good chat, didn't we, for those of you who watched it? If you haven't seen it, have a look on the YouTube channel. It's a terrific discussion about philosophy, about business, about the art of business, the reality of business, the BS in business. There's all sorts of things we covered that in that show. And I thought Nick set the scene quite beautifully for using story at work and how effective and how ineffective it can be. So I suspect, given the fireworks, that we'll be back on the show together in the new year. So look forward to talking to Nick again. Now, this week's show, it's actually lovely, this week's show, because it's quite an organic show. Because what happened, if you listened a couple of weeks ago, when I had a great chat with Madeleine Black, I got quite gushy and quite amazed by her ability to forgive. And it was astonishing. If you remember the story, she was gang raped when she was a teenager. And one of the first steps was to forgive herself and then forgive the people who actually did what they did to her. And it was astonishing. And she mentioned this week's guest, Marina, to me as someone who really understands and knows and talks about and digs into people's ability to investigate their forgiveness and to understand, their forgiveness. So that's why I'm quite excited about it. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Marina. Marina, welcome to Artefact Live. It's lovely to see you again. How are you?
Hi there. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
And let me have a go now. I always apologise to guests. I have a go at your second name, Marina Cantacuzino.
Cantacuzino.
Nearly. Yeah, I told you in the warm-up that I'd get it wrong. There you go. No point writing it down.
No worries.
So welcome to the show. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on. And could we begin really by asking you, what it is you do and what it is you focus on? And there was actually a quote that I got from your amazing podcast, The F Word, which was this quote here, which I'm sure everyone can see. I've built my career investigating how those who face the most complex and devastating things in life find a way through. So is that still your thing? Is that still your mission, if you like?
Yeah, it is definitely a part of my mission. Mm-hmm. I think I started my life as a freelance feature writer, a journalist. Mm. But I did loads of different types of articles, but I always found the ones that got the most attention actually were the ones that I felt were least skillfully written, because they were written in the words of the person, first person testimonies.
Right. Okay.
And those were always the stories that I got. Well, this was before emails even, I got written. People said, thank you so much for sharing that story. It's really helped me deal with, the problems that are going on in my life. And I think because of that experience of knowing that people really can walk into the stories of others when it's presented in such a sort of visceral and real and dynamic way, as opposed to a third person like a journalist interpreting it or putting their own views in. So when I came to investigate forgiveness, which happened really as a result of the Iraq War, I was very angry about the Iraq War, and I wanted to kind of create a counter narrative that highlighted stories about compassion, empathy, and forgiveness. And when I came to do that, the people I found to interview, I wrote out their stories in this first person way from the I voice, because it was much more immediate and much more effective and actually took people on the journey with them. And so that I continued to, that was in 2004. I started the Forgiveness Project. I could tell you a little bit about
Yes,
that.
please. I'd
if you
love to
like.
know that. Yes, please.
Yeah, it was not an intention or ever a plan. It was really something that happened almost by accident. So I went on that big march that some people will remember in 2003 against the Iraq War. I felt very
Yes.
angry.
Yes.
And so I always say the Forgiveness Project came out of anger. But,
Right.
you know, Brené Brown often says that anger is also one of the greatest forms of love because it's
Yes.
to do with justice and equity. So that's how I see my anger. But as a result, because I was a journalist, I was doing quite a lot of traveling with a photographer at the time. We were working for the Red Cross and Oxfam. And so I just found stories in all the countries I went to, stories of people who had experienced atrocity or violence or abuse, also perpetrators of that who changed their lives around. And they were what I call restorative stories. They were all stories which focused on recovery, healing,
Right.
and through a lens, if you like, of compassion, empathy, and forgiveness. They were big stories, you know, stories about political violence and atrocity, and quite a lot of restorative justice stories, which was like the victims and the offenders coming together and talking. And I didn't know what I would do with these stories. I collected 26.
Right.
And then I was very lucky to meet with Anita Roddick, who she died sadly, founder of the Body Shop, social activist. And she was so moved by these stories. She said, you've got to make them into an exhibition. And she gave me the money, really, to make it into a big exhibition, which I always describe as like journalism on a wall. Big portraits,
Right.
first person, eye voice narratives. We launched it at the Oxo Gallery in January 2004.
Yeah.
And it was just phenomenally successful in ways that I had never anticipated or planned.
Wow.
And from there, I was just led, really. You know, people were saying, can we use these stories? What else can you do? All the storytellers, I call them storytellers, who I met, Madeleine Black being one of them.
Yes.
Although I met her a bit later, but people like her, they all wanted to get involved. And it sort of grew into this sort of movement of people who wanted to use their stories to affect change in the world, positive change in the world.
Gosh. Now, you mentioned the success of the first person testimonies, people telling their own stories.
Yes.
Did you encourage them to do that? Did you help them to find their stories? Was that what you did, or how did it come about?
In part, I mean, because I'm a journalist by background, it was me interviewing them and writing up the stories and then checking with them. It was very collaborative.
Okay.
And then you know, changing bits here and there. Occasionally, people would write it themselves.
Right.
And that either worked or sometimes it didn't work, because actually I knew as a journalist that it couldn't be too long, that, you know, it needed to be very clear. I also knew what I needed highlighting and what wasn't helpful to highlight. And I'll give you an example of that, because I always describe the Forgiveness Project as secular, because people often assume we're a Christian organization, because it seems like people just associate forgiveness with Christianity somehow. And it was important for me that we weren't a Christian organization, because I wanted to make it very broadly inclusive. So we do have some stories that are shared by people who have a very strong faith, but we also have stories that have nothing to do with faith at all. And so sometimes with people who had a very strong faith, I always talk to them about this. I would say, I'm only going to mention it in 3 lines, and I might not actually, and we'll talk about faith rather than the religion. And this is because I want this to really reach people. And whether you like it or not, sometimes people can close down and think, well, that's not for me. I'm not a Christian. Therefore, I can't forgive. It's not for me. So I was trying always to make it as broad as possible. And part of that reach, in a way, was to also not make this about telling people they must forgive. It was really about, I saw it as a place of inquiry and exploration, so that through the stories, people would reflect on their own lives, in a way stimulating their own personal inquiry, even though the stories might not relate to, you know, what had happened in their own lives. Nevertheless, there were certain things that would always chime with people
Mhm.
and resonate. And I think I found out very quickly, because of the emails and responses I was getting, that people who receive these stories, who are exposed to these stories
Mhm.
on the website, in the exhibitions, sometimes we film them, or audio, these people were finding it immensely helpful for their own personal journeys of healing. And this was something I hadn't anticipated again. It
Yeah.
was all a great big adventure, really.
Thank you. This is fascinating for a number of reasons. One of the things that it doesn't concern me, Marina, that's not the word, but I'm often surprised, perhaps, at how few stories are out there. Real stories. When you hear, particularly politicians, despite everyone telling them they need to tell more stories, they still don't do it. The beginning of the COVID situation, there was no stories being told. It was all just numbers, and it doesn't work for the majority of people, and they wonder why people don't engage. I mean, it's blinking obvious, but the thing that I am really intrigued by, and your work is a fantastic example of how it can work in the workplace. Where, I mean, I used to be, after my scientific career, I was HR director, and then I was in business consulting for a long time. And stories are nowhere. It's so unusual to come across a chief executive or a culture. I mean, actually, Nick said last week that the stories that companies tell inside is actually the culture, which I thought was a really interesting perspective. But there's it appears, and this is why I want to dig a bit further on what you've just said. It appears there's a resistance to telling one's own stories. Now, I make a living talking, and the only way you can differentiate yourself as a speaker is to tell your own stories. If you do a regurgitation job like a Simon Sinek or something like that, you just get the same old stuff coming out that's been going on for 50 years. Everyone's heard it before. But if you tell your own story, there's something changes in the room. It changes.
Yeah, I think that's...
Does that make sense?
Oh, it totally makes sense. And I think it's because you have to show a degree of vulnerability to share your own stories, which is very likely why the corporate sector are so averse to it. They'll tell other people's stories very happily.
Yeah.
As with the charitable sector, actually, they'll happily go and plunder other people's stories. And I'm afraid I was a bit of a part of that in my journalistic career. But to tell your own stories and be in control of your story, I think is something that we support people to do. Just going back to your other question, in that we provide a platform that people can access. And from that, many people have gone on to write books, to perform in plays that they've written, and maybe about their story. And also Jill Hicks, who's one of our storytellers, who lost both her legs in the London bombs. She now lives in Adelaide. She's very interesting because she's an interesting story for me about forgiveness, because she doesn't really like the word forgiveness, but she is all about bridging, divides and finding peaceful solutions. And she's received a lot of trolling on, through social media for her peaceful stance, because people want her to shout revenge. So partly because of that, she stood back from standing on platforms and sharing her story. And she now does art. And all her art at the beginning was all black and white abstract. And I asked her recently for a podcast, actually, was that intentional? And she said very much so. It was to sort of depict the black and white thinking of terrorism and of stuck mindsets, which are very, very narrow. And she saw that as black and white, and so that was her theme for a long time. But she also started designing prints for scarves, because it was a scarf that saved her life. She happened to be wearing a scarf that day. She said she never, on the day of the bomb, she never ever wore scarves, but for some weird reason she wore a scarf that day, and that scarf she used as a tourniquet around her legs. Oh, gosh. And it saved her life. So now, years later, she's making prints of scarves, and she says there's a story attached to the scarf, and she says, I want people to share their stories when they're wearing my scarves. So this is how it filters down into all sorts of different ways of sharing stories, because as a journalist, I've always loved the written word, but
Mm-hmm.
I soon realized it wasn't for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Or
Wow.
spoken word.
Yes. I think the referencing to Brené Brown is interesting, and her work around vulnerability and
Yeah.
truth, etc.
Yeah.
I do think she's become somewhat of a caricature of herself more recently, though. I don't think it had a good. It began very, very well, but I think it's. I don't know. It might just be me. I think I'm not as interested anymore as I was, which is really disappointing because I was really interested in it at the beginning.
Yeah.
But could you just tease that little vulnerability bit out again? Because I think you're right, incidentally. I think it is in the corporate world. We have a. Well, I'm not really in the corporate world anymore, but when I was in the corporate world, it was all very, I don't like using stereotypes, but macho. It was all very sales. We're going to sell. And I remember doing a project. I used to head up a group that used to pitch for work. And what we used to do is, and again, guilty, as you just said, I was guilty of all the BS, the usual stuff. And then I read, I can't remember what it was. I think it might have been one of Daniel Pink's books, or the Heath brothers. I can't remember. It doesn't matter. And I read in there a case study. It was a story, and I thought, stories. And then I started to persuade the bid teams to actually tell stories rather than saying, if you come to us, you'll save 4%. And it completely transformed it. And we doubled our win rate. We doubled it.
Not surprised.
Yeah. But when I left, they didn't continue doing it. It seems odd to me. And what is it about vulnerability? Because, so I haven't asked you a question. I'm just making an observation. But when I spoke to Madeleine, if folks are watching and you haven't seen the episode with Madeleine, it was 2 episodes ago. It was episode 53. I actually asked her very directly, is it good for you to stand on stage and tell people you were gang raped when you were 13 and do it every week? And she said, well, I've got post-traumatic growth. That's how she has framed that. How do you feel about that? And I'm not talking about Madeleine. I'm talking about the general.
No, it's a very good point you make. And there was a lovely quote recently from Michaela Cole. She was the writer and performer in I May Destroy You. And she said, which was about her own sexual assault. And she says, like any other experience I found traumatic in my life, I found it therapeutic to write about it. And she says, she talks about twisting the narrative of pain into one of hope.
Twisting.
And even humor, So, but she, unlike some of the storytellers that I work with, including Madeleine, sort of puts it into a drama. And there it is for people to take. She's not telling it every day. She's not talking about it all the time. And I think people like Madeleine are very good at self-care and look after themselves.
Okay.
Well, and we encourage people, because we've worked in prisons over the years, and we've taken people, and Madeleine's done it actually, come in and to share their story, their restorative story with prisoners. And 1 or 2 of them have said, and I've always encouraged this, I've done it now, it's enough. 1 or 2 have actually said, I felt re-traumatized that time. I'm not going to do it again. It triggered things. It wasn't helpful. One woman did it on the anniversary of her son's murder, and the culprit had never been caught. And she was talking to young men in a Young Offenders Institute, and she started to feel, and they went like that, and she went like that, and it wasn't helpful. It wasn't a good storytelling experience for them or for her, most importantly for her. And I learned a lot from that. You always learn from your mistakes in a way, much more than when things go right. I learned, because of that, I learned to really support the storytellers more, to encourage them to stop telling their story as well. And so some of them do, and they love the fact that it's there on the Forgiveness Project website. So if ever people ask, they might say, well, you look at my story here, or they may have written a book, but others like Madeleine, it is part of their healing process to tell their stories. One woman said to me, telling my story saved me from it. Goodness. And I think that's sort of beautifully summed up.
Fabulous.
And we work with former perpetrators of violence, people who have been involved in the far right movement, Islamic extremists, ex-offenders, all who have, changed their aggression into a force for peace. And some of them share their story for very different reasons. It's very often about taking responsibility and paying back and wanting to make a change. I mean, everybody actually shares their story, not just for their own purposes, but to create a change movement in the world.
Yes.
And they know, as you know, and I know, that the personal narrative is where the power lies.
And I mean, beautiful segue into what I wanted to talk to you about here, because the change aspect of this, this is the bit that I saw it on the screen with Madeleine. I mean, I know Madeleine. I've known Madeleine for a couple of years, but we'd never had that even virtual, conversation where she really went through the story, and it was the way she changed that really got me. That was the thing. It was and I mean, this is a layman's perspective, so tell me if I'm being an idiot, Marina, but it looked like that forgiveness part, which started with herself, which did surprise me somewhat, I have to be honest. But then I saw it, and she became, and you could almost see her body language changing. I mean, it was really powerful.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, I'm going, everybody in the corporate world and everybody in the self-help world and everybody in the personal development world is looking for change. Or rather, transformation is probably the better word, because I'm a biologist. But I wonder again, why? Is it just the vulnerability? Is it just that? Or is it just too difficult?
Well, explain what you mean a bit more.
Well, I mean, it's like everybody talks about in the corporate world, Maria, they always want to change. Want to change a company, change a culture, change a perspective. And certainly in the last couple of years, I've seen more people doing this. It's about shaming. I mean, there's an awful lot of shaming going on, and there's an awful lot of self-flagellation going on, which I just find really boring, to be honest. And I don't believe anything comes from shame. I just don't believe it. And I might be wrong. You tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe it. I think what you described sounds like why isn't everybody doing this rather than all this political correctness and taking offence every 5 minutes?
Well, I think it's very much to do with that, people not feeling safe in their environments, whatever they are. I mean, we're not immune to that within an organisation, which is a charity called the Forgiveness Project. We've had some difficult times over the years to do with, employment issues. And the way we've found to deal with that is to adopt a technique, which is really a restorative conversation. And you can use it for storytelling as well, which is like a circle process where each speaks in times and there's a talking piece and you hand it round. And it really, there's something in the structure that people feel safe with. And they also feel safe with the fact they don't have to speak, and that actually when they are speaking, only they are speaking and only they have to be listened to, and people can't butt in. So as you're going around the circle, if someone wants to say something about the person opposite, no, they can't. They have to wait till it's their turn. And actually, by the time the talking piece gets to them, they've probably changed their mind about what they said because they've listened to about 4 other perspectives. So we've used that for trustee meetings, for courses we've run in prisons. I know people use it in their family settings. It's an amazing sort of form of helping people share, because what you're talking about, people are afraid to be intimate, people are afraid to be vulnerable, and therefore afraid to be unable to be authentic. And that's what happens, I think.
Lovely. Is that process on your website?
No, but there's a woman, we've been trained by something called Peace of the Circle. She's based in Toronto, Evelyn Zellerer, Peace of the Circle, and she's got everything about restorative conversations, peacemaking circle process, which comes from Indigenous people, communities. Okay. It's ancient form of conversation, and it's incredibly powerful.
Oh, fantastic. I will certainly have a look at that and put it on the notes from the show. So we'll have a look at your artifact in a minute, but just before we do, Marina, I'll put you off for a second. I hope you found that interesting. You're watching ARTEFACTLive with me, Scott MacArthur. I love this because, some of these questions are quite difficult, but I love the fact there's a hint there that there's a process. And people like processes. They might not like being vulnerable, but people like processes. So I'll certainly investigate that. But I just wanted to remind everybody that at the end of the month, I'll be doing my monthly Storytelling at Work course via Funzing. It's been really successful so far, so I hope some of you can come along and watch it and take part in it, because it's brilliant. And I do believe that stories can give you an edge at work and everywhere else. So I think it's been nice to hear Marina in some ways reinforce that. So Marina, we've got you for another 15 minutes.
Lovely.
What's your artifact? You'd very kindly agreed to bring an
I'm
artifact.
going to show it to you in a minute.
Yeah.
I'm just
Yeah.
building into it. I'm thinking about what to share here.
Okay.
But so, I had this very powerful experience recently, which does relate to two artifacts, actually, and one I no longer have. So when I got married years ago, my father took me to this very well-known potter called Lucy Ree, who had a studio in London. She's since died, but she was sort of Eastern European, came here after the war, very well thought of. And our wedding present was to choose a pot. And we chose this beautiful, it was about this size,
Yes.
Beautiful sort of yellow ochre. I had it for years and, had all my earrings in it. And then my parents both died quite recently, both within a short time of each other. I had a very good relationship with them, but I always find it hard to cry, and there was so much going on in my life. I just, did a lot of reading around grief and thinking, why aren't I feeling sadder? Okay, they were 89, both of them. They were ready to die, so it wasn't sad, but I just didn't understand why I couldn't cry. And then we were selling quite a few things because of it, and I said to my husband, I've been trying to sell it because it was worth a bit over the years. And we sold it, basically, this pot, just after my parents died, because we were selling other things. Didn't get as much as I thought because there was a hairline crack in it. Anyway, my friend over this last summer said to me, she knew about this woman, Lucy Ree, the potter, and she asked me about it. And suddenly my tears started coming. I just thought,
really?
Why did I do that? It was like, I'm very unsentimental. I'd taken very few things from my parents' house. And it was the one thing I had that connected to me, particularly to my father. And I felt grief-stricken in a way that I hadn't expected. And I just was so sad that I'd sold it. So sad. And it's like, I thought, it's just a pot. But anyway, the end of the story is that my husband said, let's use the money to buy something else that replaces it. And this is, I'm going to just show you.
Yeah.
Do you see that?
I do.
It's called a donkey.
Yeah.
And it has little books in. And it's a design. It's called Isocom Donkey. It's a 1930s design to keep penguin books in. And my father was very connected with that whole movement at that time. Not at that time, because he was too young but it was very connected with my parents, that design. So I bought it.
Lovely.
I love it.
Right, great.
That's
lovely. That's lovely. I gave me goosebumps. That's lovely.
I feel better.
Good. Well, that's again the amazing thing about an artifact. That am I sentimental? I think I maybe am. I think I maybe more than you anyway. I think, but the story about the connection. I mean, I don't know if we're going off piste a bit here, but I always think that. I mean, I've got a box of my grandfather's letters. It's a big foot deep.
Yeah.
The letters that he wrote to me, and I don't really read them, Marina. But you know what I do too? I smell them.
Yeah.
Because he's there. He's in that box. There's something about that type of artifact that he used to use. The Old Spice aftershave, white bottle with a wee ship on it. Yeah. You can smell it in the box, and when he died 20 years ago, So yeah, very powerful, very powerful. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. That was very nice of you to do that. And so moving on, and I'm sure people will appreciate that. What's your favourite story?
Well,
hard
you
question.
sort of warned me about this. You said it could relate to a book or a play.
Yeah.
And so I was just going to mention the play that's had the most effect on me, and I saw it 5 times.
Right.
It was called Black Watch, and it was produced by the National Theatre of Scotland. And it was about the Black Watch military I don't even, I know so little about wars and what the terms are, but
Yes.
the battalion that went to Iraq, and it was the most stunning. I love theatre, but I hate bad theatre.
Yes.
And and it was the most brilliant bit of theatre I have ever seen. It involved incredible storytelling about how these young men were recruited from, poor areas in Glasgow and taken out there. And it included wonderful music, Scottish traditional Highland music, very beautiful poetry, movement, incredible movement.
Yes.
And it was just fantastic. And it just had every element. And I traveled the country to see it. So I saw
Did
it
you?
4 or 5 times. I went
Oh,
to
you
all
really did like it.
because it was touring. And then it
Yeah.
came back after 2 years, and I saw it a couple more times. And
Wow.
I don't think it'll ever come back again, sadly.
Do you
Had
think?
its time. I think it's had its time. The Iraq War is something.
Yeah,
We've moved on.
we have. We've got other things to worry about now, haven't we?
Yeah,
Plenty of
that's
other
what I
things.
mean. That's what I mean. Yeah.
Is it available on DVD or anything? Is it
I don't
something?
think it is. I think you can get on YouTube. You can find some of the music. Actually, it's
Right.
haunting and beautiful. So I'd
Right. Okay.
recommend it.
It's not one I've come across actually.
Yeah.
No, there's something good off the back of my head about it, but I can't remember. I never saw
Yeah.
it. I know that, but you mentioned theatre there and how this particular piece really affected you. Is it the multiple inputs that did it?
Yeah, I think it is. And music.
Right. Okay.
I think without the music, that was the key element for me.
Right. So the music that matched the narrative.
Yeah, matched it exactly.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
It's like, again, it's another thing that you don't see a lot of in the corporate world. I mean, I've had the absolute pleasure of working with some wonderful artists, strategic artists who go into organizations and try to help them make sense of what their organization is about. But there's always been something missing there. And one of my pals, he's a brilliant artist called Julian Burton. He always says, we're not seeing the whole story. And he's the artist, but he said they're not. And I'm just thinking now it links back to where we started the conversation about vulnerability, because they might just tell you what they want you to hear rather than what the reality is. Julian's theory is it's to do with the patriarchy. I don't agree with that, but he thinks there's a straitjacket controlling everything from the top. Right. I'm not sure I agree with that. That may be badly representing what he thinks, but I think it's much more complex than that. And I think that what you've said about that play and the multiple channels is something we could all learn from at work, because how often do you hear music at work? How often do you real people actually laughing, and I guess that leads me to my final question for you today. I've really enjoyed. It's a shame we can't talk for 5 hours, but what do you think we can learn? I mean, you've done, your 26 stories at the beginning. You've done these exhibitions. You've been awarded an MBA for your work, indeed, in this field. What do you think you have learned that you can pass on, given all of that? Because you were a journalist. You mean you weren't a are you a psychologist? I don't think you're a psychologist, are you?
No. Writer.
So, yeah. A writer, just a writer, eh? Yeah, I'm not sure that's very accurate. I wish I could just be a writer. What have you learned that you think that your legacy might be, and what could you hand on and say, here's the baton, take that, from all this experience you've had, because it's really significant experience.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things I care most about is, because while I think I said to you that we share big stories in the Forgiveness Project, often being out there in the public domain to do with, acts of terrorism, etc. Yeah. All I've got the most satisfaction for is that it's helped people with their own inner grievances and grudges and resentments. Looking and thinking and lining yourself up for forgiveness or to forgive, can change and transform lives. And I think the way I've been in the middle of writing a book, actually, I've just nearly finished, but some of it is spent on much smaller transgressions. And the thing that makes me really sad is the way people cut people out of their lives. I know there are good reasons sometimes to do that for safety reasons, but so often it's just because someone has offended you, that they've said something wrong, that And it's so much easier just to shut the door and you don't reply, and you freeze them out of your life.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I've really sort of investigated and tried to share stories where people haven't done that in this book. And I feel it's just so important because it's so easy to give up on people.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it comes down to vulnerability. You know, it's just people so often, you know, when a family member offends, because they haven't lived up to your own expectations of how someone should and must be, you know, it's just become so easy just to shut that person out of your life.
Right.
And I think compassion, empathy, forgiveness, you know, these are just such vital qualities to kind of, I sort of want to say, you need to work at them, you know, to make them bigger and better and greater. You can't just expect, I'm a compassionate person, you know.
Yes.
I think you have to think about these things and reflect. Self-reflection and is so important, and it's a huge part of all this. And so I think I'm rambling, but it's only because it's complex, and it's very much about taking responsibility for one's life and not expecting other people to behave as we think they should. You know, I'm a great believer in live and let live in many respects, and honouring people for who they are. And you know, can I give you a tiny little example? My husband's mother died last week, very old. She needed to die, but he was so close to her, and he looked after her and cared for her at the end. And one of our friends couldn't say anything to him. You know, we saw this friend, and he said absolutely nothing. Didn't say, I'm sorry to hear about your father. And I felt really angry. And I felt upset. Why can you not say to him, I'm sorry, or put your hand on his shoulder or something? Why pretend it hasn't happened? And then I had to remind myself, this is my expectation. This man is a loving person, a caring person. He's for some reason in his story, he cannot do that. He cannot. Or he's been told not to. Or he's grown up in a way that if people die, you ignore it. And then once I am able to go into his story a bit and to sort of open my heart, that's what I was trying to say earlier, opening your heart.
Yeah.
Then I understand it. It's not an issue anymore.
My goodness, it's like a form of meditation you're describing here, isn't it? Because it's Maria, that has been an absolute pleasure and a privilege to speak to you. Madeleine said you were inspiring. She was right. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
It's fine. Can I leave you with one quote?
Yeah,
I love about storytelling. I don't know if you've heard this one. It's by Ben Okri, the poet. And he said that stories are the secret reservoir of values. Change the stories that individuals and nations live by and tell themselves, and you will change the individuals and nations. So I love that.
I hadn't heard that. That is gorgeous. What a lovely piece to end on. Thank you very much for sharing that, and thanks very much for your descriptions of what you've been through, your open-heartedness and your honesty. It's been fabulous. Thanks again, and I really hope that at some point I get to thank you with a glass in our hand or a cup.
It'd be lovely to meet you. Thank you so much for inviting me on.
Been an absolute pleasure, and I really do hope we come across each other again. Thanks very much,
Me
Marina.
too.
Right, yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye now. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Well, that was wonderful, and I thought the quote at the end just beautifully finished the whole thing. It was an absolute joy. It's really given me a lot to think about this last few weeks. You know, I never intended to take the storytelling route down the sort of trauma path, and I'm not going to. You know, in fact, next week I'm going in a completely different direction. But nevertheless, it's been a really interesting journey for me. This, and I hope you have enjoyed it as well. So this has been ARTEFACTLive with me, Scott MacArthur, where we look at the art and the science of storytelling. And next week, my guest is going to be a chap called Paul Hargreaves. Now, Paul is really interesting. I met Paul about a year ago. I've never met him in person. We met virtually, just as part of a group who were helping each other, working together, online, etc. And he's the chief executive of the Cotswold Fair. And he's an author of Forces for Good and The Fourth Bottom Line. So if you know anything about those sorts of subjects, you can probably gather that he's very interested in how people work, how people interact, and how people relate to each other. And he's become what's known as a B Corps ambassador. Now, I'm not going to go into that in depth because I want to hear it from Paul, but I am really looking forward to it because I think that, I said during the conversation there with Marina that I think a lot of times we don't use the stories that we should. We don't act as an archaeologist. There's my Indiana Jones cut. We don't look in there and see where the stories are and find out what goes beyond the usual maps. We don't have enough of a compass to go beyond the usual maps. So I look forward to seeing Paul next week. Thank you very, very much indeed for joining me this week. I think that was a lovely show, and thanks to Marina particularly. It was terrific. Now, if you want to follow Marina or to see any more of her work, there's a couple of things here I've got her Twitter. Now, Twitter's pretty good. That's her Twitter account. If you want to follow what she's been talking about with the F Word podcast and with the Forgiveness Project. The Forgiveness Project itself is a good resource. If you're interested in this field, I highly recommend you have a look at it. So thanks once again to Marina, and I hope that we can catch up again in the future. Now, as I always say at the end of the show, I honestly believe, as described here by Chris Riddle, that a good story can act as an empathy engine. It can help you see the world through the other person's perspectives. And I think that's a really important thing to learn for us all. And I think it's becoming even more important. And you know what? I really hope that this week for you is a story-filled week, because those stories, as Marina beautifully demonstrated, can change your world. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week.